Welcome to the big picture from Washington, D.C. once again. The Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, went to Silicon Valley in California and also went to New York to address the UN General Assembly. And we have with us two distinguished scholars of the Indian scene, Lisa Curtis of the Heritage Foundation, a senior research fellow there, and Sadanand Dhume, who's a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And we look forward to a lively half-an-hour discussion. Now, Lisa, I thought that it was an interesting choice that the Prime Minister went to Silicon Valley rather than coming to Washington. And why Silicon Valley? Why do you think it was so important for India to project an image out there?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. The first is, of course, to woo investors. He's trying to convince the U.S. investor community that India is the right destination for their investment, particularly when it comes to the high-tech industry. So he's really trying to make those connections about the possibilities in India, the fact that you have millions of Facebook and Twitter users in India. So he's trying to make a case for U.S. investment. But the second is making that connection to sustainable prosperity. He talked about this a lot in his speech at the UN to the Sustainable Development Meeting. He talked about combining innovation and technology to bring up the poor, to extend services to the poor. So I think he wanted to highlight his own Digital India campaign.
He's very digitally savvy, yes.
Absolutely. I mean, to see him on the same stage, 65-year-old Indian politician on the stage with Mark Zuckerberg, a fresh, young face of high tech in the U.S., and virtually speaking from the same sheet of music, talking the same language. I think this is quite remarkable. So yeah, I think his visit to Silicon Valley was twofold. I think it has a symbolic impact and shows the kind of leader that he is, engaged with technology, focused on the poor and connecting the poor through technology, through his Digital India campaign, but also to try to gin up more foreign investment in India.
Right, Sadanand, I would ask you the same question, but also give us your take on how important you think Modi's visit is seen in the eyes of the Indian American community, of whom some very successful people live in. By the way, I mean, he's the first Indian Prime Minister to go to California in 30 years.
So I would echo what Lisa said. I think there's certainly I agree with everything she said, but I would add a third dimension, and I'd say that this also for him at some level plays well for a domestic audience in terms of domestic politics. Mm-hmm. This kind of positions him as this, savvy person who's appeals to the youth of India. Many of these people are on social media, and so when they see him hanging out with Mark Zuckerberg and doing a town hall at Facebook, it sort of bolsters this idea of Modi as this person who may not be young himself,
we must
but is young at
Mark
heart.
Zuckerberg
Mark
is
Zuckerberg,
the head of
Facebook.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a kind of sophisticated domestic play going on. Also, he knows, of course, that everything that he does in the U.S. is covered in real time by the Indian media. You had his speech, for instance, yesterday being covered full-time, trending at #1 Twitter in India. Mm-hmm. So there's that domestic element to this. Now, for the Indian American community, of course, Modi is a very popular figure by and large, and I think that this really should be seen as part of a twofer, where the first part was Madison Square Garden, the East Coast last year. Now he comes to the West Coast, looks at a different demographic, still a demographic that's largely sympathetic to him.
Mm-hmm. Good. I wanted to also ask you a little bit about an article you recently wrote in the Wall Street Journal about perceptions of the Indian American community, the way they are perceived back in India, and the way they perceive the US-India relationship. I thought you had some very interesting things to say.
Well, in a nutshell, the point I'm making in the Wall Street Journal is that when Indians look at the Indian American community, they tend to see only half of the picture. when they look at the success of people such as Sundar Pichai, who's the CEO of Google, or Satya Nadella at Microsoft, or Indra Nooyi at PepsiCo, or the success of authors such as Jhumpa Lahiri, there's a kind of self-congratulatory tone in Indian coverage of this success. And I'm not taking away from anybody's hard work or talent, but what I wanted to point out is that people need to give more credit to America. It is America that is this land of opportunity that has allowed people to flourish, and that the real lesson of the Indian American diaspora is not their prosperity or not their success, but the fact that markets, merit, individual rights matter, and they work. And so if Indians want to be a little bit more introspective about this, what they need to ask themselves is, why do so many of the smartest Indians have to leave to make it? And what does that say about the mistakes that India made? And to put it very bluntly in summing up, I said that the Indian American community are essentially economic refugees from Nehru's socialism and Indira Gandhi's license permit Raj.
But that trend is still continuing. I mean, is it
because
only...
of the legacy?
Mm-hmm.
There's a legacy issue. If you follow socialism for 45 years, and then you sort of unshackle yourself, but partially. It's not as though India has had sweeping reform since 1991. So you go from being a completely shackled economy to being a somewhat less shackled economy. The fact is there's a very strong economic connection between migration rates. This is true not just of India, but it's true across the world. And for a long time, India is going to continue to play catch up because it made some terrible mistakes in the first 4 decades after independence. Mm-hmm. And that's just a reality, and I think that for many people it's an awkward or an unpleasant reality,
right.
But it's something that I thought was important for people to contend with.
Yeah, it's a hangover, I guess, of a certain image of India that was there.
It's a hangover of reality, not of image.
Right. And how do you think that affects India's overall image and perception in the world at large, but specifically in the United States?
Well, I think it does impact India's image. And Sadanand talked about the first 4 decades of
right.
India and focusing on socialism, but there's also questions being asked about the last decade. And where is that second generation of reforms that everybody expected? Of course, in the 1990s, India moved forward on reforms, unleashing the tiger. Everybody was excited about its progress, but people expected that second wave of reforms. And we've yet to really see that happen. And I think there was enormous hope that Prime Minister Modi would be that person who would project that second wave of economic reform, those land reforms, intellectual property rights reform, labor reforms. There are so many issues that still need to be dealt with from that era of socialism. So I think that Prime Minister Modi is chipping away at that image, and he is bringing hope that India's economy will reach its potential. But I think there are still some skeptics out there. And we saw that the U.S. congressional members that wrote a letter to President Obama asking him to raise some of these issues, talking about the problems that American foreign investors still faced in India with regard to trade barriers and other issues. So I think we still do have those concerns. That's the other side of the story.
Right. I mean, that's a very good point, actually. I don't know what you feel, Sadanand, that, first of all, do you think that there are serious efforts that are being made and more can be made in the present circumstances, which are partly political back in India because Prime Minister Modi one house of parliament, not the other one. But that's not the only issue, many would argue. Many would say that even Prime Minister Modi's own economic worldview may be pro-business, but it is not necessarily well structured in the reform mechanism that should accompany a pro-business worldview. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I would also agree with the points that Lisa raised. Now, there's certainly a great degree of hope that if anyone can get reforms moving again, it is Prime Minister Modi. He had a genuinely good business record in Gujarat. He's seen as a person who is able to move things and get things done. But it's also true that 16 months in, we have not seen the kind of reform that many people were expecting. And the question...
Let me stop you there. Why do you think that has happened?
So,
is it just political or is it more than that? Because, it's succeeding in Gujarat in a business-friendly environment is one thing. It's quite another to come to the center and try and govern this whole rather complicated nation.
I think it's a great question, and I would say that I have multiple concerns on this front. I do believe that the Prime Minister and the government is well-intentioned, and I think that is fair. But I wonder about whether he's willing to take political risk for reform. So far, the evidence of that is quite limited. I wonder whether he relies
What
too
do you mean by
much.
political risk?
Do difficult things that make good economic sense, even if they're politically tough to do. For instance, privatize a loss-making company like Air India.
Is there opposition from his party?
There is opposition internally. They have not thought this through. They are ambivalent about it, right? So in terms of doing things that are difficult to do politically but make economic sense, he's shown a great degree of caution. I also think that he seems to rely a little bit too much on administration. You cannot do everything that India needs to get done simply by whipping the IAS. And the problem is that so far, if you look at what they tout as their big economic achievements, they've essentially relied on making India's creaky administrative machinery function better. So stuff like the bank accounts for the poor, 180 million bank accounts. Stuff like using Aadhaar to cut the national subsidy bill on cooking gas. These are good things, don't get me wrong, but these are insufficient. What we'd like to see, or what I would like to see, and many people would like to see, is some evidence that he is going to allow the markets to play a greater role in the Indian economy, even if he has to take a little bit of political pain for that.
Right. So what you're essentially saying is that even the politics is not just restricted to opposition in the Rajya Sabha or something like that, or the opposition of the Congress party, which is actually not that powerful at the moment, but also from within the organization. But does Mr. Modi himself believe that an open market, or rather an open attitude towards the rest of the world, which goes with the market reforms, is the way to go for India? Do you think that he is himself, given his background, he himself is ready to take up that kind of a reform-oriented policy?
I'll keep my answer brief, but I think that he is definitely a modernizer. The jury is still out on whether he's a liberalizer. I do think that he's not someone who's afraid of trade. I think in many ways his instincts are right, but what he has been unable to do so far is to turn some of those instincts and to turn some of those slogans into policy. And that's the part that needs to be done.
I think that's a very interesting difference that he made between a modernizer and a liberalizer. I think we should pursue this more in the second half of the program. We'll be back in a short while.
Political slugfest intensifies in Bihar. Regional leaders fight a do-or-die battle. Who wins Bihar and who loses relevance? Watch Verdict 2015 on Rajya Sabha television.
Welcome back. We are having a discussion on the state of US-India relations in the context of Prime Minister Modi's visit to the Silicon Valley and to New York. We have with us Lisa Curtis and Sadanand Dhume. Just before the break, Sadanand made a very interesting difference between a modernizer and a liberalizer. that Mr. Modi's intentions might be good. But this is a very interesting way of putting it. What do you think?
Yes, I think this is an interesting way of putting it, and I would apply it to the trade versus manufacturing issue. Because what we've seen on the trade issues is that, yes, Modi has not been much of a liberalizer. And in fact, under Modi, India played a very obstructionist role in the WTO trade talks. So I think there's something to this idea that he's more of a modernizer. And he is focused on building up India's manufacturing base. He wants to indigenize defense production.
How is that different from the approach of the earlier Congress regime or even the earlier BJP regime in terms of even Make in India? Is that too sort of, doesn't it sort of smell of autarky somewhere?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, but let's also look at the fact that he has raised the FDI caps in the defense and insurance sector, for that matter. So I think the idea is that, partnering with foreign companies and bringing in the technology into India. But I think that's a good point. Is how much of this is getting back to autarky and centralized planning ideas. But I think he brings a different twist on the issue, and I think he is talking about bringing in international companies. I mean, again, getting back to what he was doing in Silicon Valley. He's trying to increase foreign direct investment in India. But he doesn't want to, just focus on the trade issues,
right.
Liberalizing trade. He really wants to focus on manufacturing in India, producing in India, but with this twist of, yes, welcoming in foreign direct investment. I think he personally is interested in increasing investment. I think he understands that investment is important to India's economic future. But, he's still contending with the political forces both within and without side of his party. But I think he personally understands the importance of bringing in more foreign investment. That's my opinion.
With the American defense sector, he's had some progress there. I mean, there's a lot of, first of all, defense supplies from the US to India have risen, but there's a lot of joint manufacturing proposals going around. There's even some talk I heard of the F-16, that Lockheed Martin might be interested in collaborating there to produce the F-16, or at least some parts of it, with India. Have you heard about it? And what do you think of the defense collaboration, defense production collaboration?
So I haven't heard of the particular F-16 thing, but I think it would be profoundly unfair to call this government autarkic. This is not remotely. This is not remotely.
I said it smells of that kind of thing.
No, it doesn't even smell of autarky because it's not. He's not. No autarkic government goes around wooing investors from the United States to Japan to South Korea.
True.
What you have in Make in India is that, at its best, what Make in India could be is a program that incentivizes manufacturers to come to India. At its worst, Make in India could be a form of protectionism. And that's the sort of balance that they're going to have to find. I think that they are leaning towards the right end of the balance, which is you make things easier, you cut down on red tape, you have fewer permissions. They haven't really implemented all of that yet, but that seems to be their effort. So you make India a better place so that it makes more sense, whether you're Lockheed Martin or you're General Motors or you're Ford or anyone else, to come and set up shop in India because it's an attractive market where it's been easier to do business. That certainly seems to be what their intention is.
Yeah, the difference being that Make in India in an earlier era meant keep everybody out, but whereas in this case what you're saying is that Make in India means come into India and collaborate with us and make it.
The danger though is what you need to pay attention to is how you do it. Do you do it by making India a more attractive investment destination? I think that's an excellent thing. Or do you do it by putting up barriers like the previous government was trying to do and try to strong-arm companies? That's what you want to guard against. And I'd say so far I'd say they would lean more towards trying to make India a more attractive place to do business, which is good. In terms of defense, I think it's a very exciting space. They have recognized that India is the world's largest arms importer, and they would like to use the enormous amounts that India spends on defense to build a kind of industrial base. Where I think they may have made a mistake is even though they have raised FDI caps, as Lisa pointed out, they've been a little bit too conservative. I think that they would have gotten much farther if instead of 49, they'd gone to 51. Just psychologically, that makes a difference to defense companies. Perhaps that will happen. But I think the general idea to collaborate more closely with American companies in the defense sector is very welcome, and one of the things where this government has tried to move relatively fast.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and move on to foreign affairs. And after all, Mr. Modi is here not just to go to Silicon Valley, but also to go to the UN General Assembly meeting, where he has had a very successful meeting, it looks like, with President Barack Obama. And it's not just a successful meeting, it's the third such meeting, if I'm not mistaken, in a year. So that's quite unusual for an Indian Prime Minister and an American President to be doing. It's unusual in any relationship, bilateral relationship. So where do you think this is going, and what is the compelling motive in the American scheme of things to partner India and to boost India's prospects?
Well, if you look at India and you compare the U.S. and what both countries are interested in terms of the future and their strategic concerns, geopolitical concerns, really there's very little daylight in what both countries are seeking to achieve, both in terms of keeping a secure, stable environment in the Asia-Pacific, keeping sea lanes of communication open.
Counterterrorism?
Counterterrorism in the region, ensuring democracy takes root in the countries. Of course, India has not been traditionally as interested in promoting democracy as maybe the U.S., but certainly India would like to nurture democracy where it can, particularly if you look at the South Asia region, what's been happening in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal. India is, I think, seeking to play a positive role in ensuring that democratic trends continue in these countries. So I think there's a lot of converging strategic interests between the two countries. And if you look around what's happening, the volatility in the world, whether it be the rise of ISIS, what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine, throughout the Middle East, the democratic revolutions, when the U.S. sees India, it sees a stable, democratic, increasingly prosperous country, that shares its democratic values. So there's a lot to be said for those commonalities between our two countries. And I think, in addition to that, you have a very strong personal rapport between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi. That comes across.
Let me ask you the same question with an added dimension. There are some who would argue, and who do argue, that India is a major regional power with regional interests which do not always coincide with the worldview of a superpower like America, for whom regional stability is important, but there is a world picture that is also, that goes along with it, the regional picture. And sometimes these don't always coincide, the views. What do you think?
I would say that what you're seeing is a broad convergence, in fact, between the US and India. And even if you look at India, if you look at the South Asian context, I think the US and India very often want the same end. Where they sometimes differ is on the means. So take, for instance, a country like Bangladesh, where both India and the US would like to ensure that Bangladesh remains a relatively secular polity, remains a country where Islamism doesn't take hold. But they could have different views on how to get there, where India, for instance, might believe that the only way to get there is to heavily back Sheikh Hasina, whereas the US might believe that the way to get there is to sort of be more even-handed between the Awami League and the BNP. So what you have very often, and for a while you had a sort of similar situation in Sri Lanka, where again both countries had similar concerns, but maybe India's emphasis on the Tamil question was more about what happens to the Tamil population going forward, whereas the US also had quite a lot of concern about how do you deal with war crimes that had occurred in the past. But the emphasis in detail, but broadly speaking, both countries would like to ensure that Sri Lanka does not become a Chinese satellite. Both countries would like to ensure that the minorities are treated fairly. Both countries would like to see democracy strengthened. So what you have is a commonality to a large degree in terms of ends. You have problems in terms of how do you get there. And I would say the most acute in this case really is a question of Pakistan, where again, it's not as though the US doesn't understand Indian concerns.
Is there a convergence of views on Pakistan at this point of time?
I think at a 30,000-foot view, there is a convergence. But I think on the ground in terms of what to do, in terms of the role of the Pakistani military, in terms of how to deal with Pakistani state sponsorship of terrorism, how do you fix the sort of triangle between the US, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and what that means for India's security, there's a lot that needs to be worked out.
I think that's a very interesting point, because that's one area where Mr. Modi's current regional emphasis, which has been by most accounts most successful, that it's running up against a wall when it comes to Pakistan. Now, whether that wall is a creation of internal Indian interests or not, we don't know. But is it possible to deal with Pakistan in any other way than Mr. Modi is dealing with right now?
Well, I think it's interesting that Pakistan didn't come up in his speech to the UN, unlike last year, if you recall, when he did very much raise Pakistan and Pakistan's support for terrorism in his speech at the UN. So I think his government is taking a different tack when it comes to Pakistan and focusing more on working with the U.S. on counterterrorism issues. The fact that there was a separate joint statement on counterterrorism between the U.S. and India at the Strategic and Commercial Dialogue, I think is very telling. It was very clear on the fact that Pakistan needed to bring the perpetrators of the 26/11 attacks to justice and to crack down. So I think what the Modi government is doing is focusing on cooperating more with the U.S. on terrorism and approaching it in that direction. And
I'm afraid we are going to run out of time very soon, so I want to thank both of you. That's a very good note to end on, that there is apparently some kind of a convergence of views on at least counterterrorism and issues that are Pakistan related, but which are positively viewed by both sides as a possible area of cooperation. Thank you very much, and goodbye from Washington.